Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here this evening. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. We're broadcasting live tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Tonight, we are virtually gathered to celebrate the publication of Details Are Unprintable, Wayne Lonergan and the Sensational Café Society Murder by Allan Levine. This will be a very special event. You're in for quite a treat, as this will also feature a conversation hosted by our good friend, Terry MacLeod. You'll notice that there is a Q&A button that appears just at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please do feel free to enter your questions there for Allan at any point during the evening. Rest assured you will not interrupt us. And we'll get to those questions immediately following the presentation and the conversation. Allan Levine is an award-winning author and historian based here in Winnipeg. He has written 16 books, including Toronto, Biography of a City, King, William Lyon Mackenzie King, A Life Guided by the Hand of Destiny, which won the Alexander Kennedy Isbister Award for nonfiction, and Coming of Age, A History of the Jewish People of Manitoba, which won the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award. His most recent book, Seeking the Fabled City, The Canadian Jewish Experience, was published in October 2018 and was longlisted for the 2019 RBC Taylor Prize. In addition, just last Friday, the University of Winnipeg announced that Allan will be honored with an honorary degree at the end of this month in recognition of exceptional service, achievement, and distinction for his work as a historian, writer, educator, and public intellectual. Host Terry MacLeod is an independent Emmy-nominated journalist, Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal recipient, and former CBC radio and TV host, presenter, and producer. He is currently the host and producer of the soon-to-be-released podcast, Prairie Design Lab, with the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Manitoba. Please put your virtual hands together for Allan Levine and Terry MacLeod.
Hello, Allan Levine.
Hi, how are you?
So I'm so glad to be here. I can hardly wait to ask you way too many questions.
Okay. Before you start, I'm going to take a quick opportunity before we get into the discussion, just to thank a few people, starting with John Taves at McNally Robinson for hosting this virtual launch, my first and hopefully last one. Terry for participating, my publisher Lyons Press, and executive editor Rick Reinhardt, who may or may not be watching. My agent Hilary McMahon, who I know is right now sipping a glass of wine in Toronto and watching, and I thank her for her friendship and support and for dealing with my many emails. And my family, Angie, Alexander, Shannon, Mia, and Jeff, and last but certainly not least, the fantastic trio of Anna, Cole, and Mickey, our grandchildren. Someday in the future, I look forward to discussing this book with them, but for right now, it's Sesame Street and Peppa Pig, not murder mystery. So that is about it. And I thank all of you for coming, and from I know friends of mine from across North America are watching this, and I suppose that's one of the positives of doing a book launch like this.
Shall we plunge in, Allan?
Sure, go ahead.
So why were you so interested in telling the story of Wayne Lonergan and the Sensational Café Society Murder?
Well, I have to say that I had spent many years searching for a particular kind of story that I wanted to tell. I was always interested in, I've written for historical mystery, so, and I'm a fan of all the TV kinds of films, and true crime, as you know, has grown a lot over the years. So in my searching, I came across a article from Cosmopolitan magazine in 1948 by the great detective writer Raymond Chandler, in which it's entitled 10 Greatest Crimes of the Century. And it was an interesting article. Some of them I had heard about. He basically lists and writes about them. And the first one was about the Lindbergh kidnapping, of Charles, the pilot Charles Lindbergh's son, who was killed. And some of the others, like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, people had heard about. Some of the others I had not heard about. And I started digging around, and there was books that had been written about most of them. And then I came to number 9, and it was a story about Wayne Lonergan, who was accused of killing his young wife in New York. And I had never heard of it. And the fact that he was Canadian from Toronto also, I thought, was interesting right away. And I started digging into that story. And that's really how I came to it. I would say that was the beginning of my quest to find information about him.
So where did you dig when you began to do that?
Okay, so that's the thing. I mean, I wrote the book really. There was a lot of newspapers. I mean, the newspapers were full of the story. As soon as I have access to databases of all newspapers, especially the New York Times and other papers, tabloids, and I realized that if you can check all these papers, and historical research is much easier nowadays using stuff like this. But I saw right away that the coverage was extensive, and the story was interesting for a number of reasons that I can get into in a minute. But I wasn't really good enough, and then I discovered that there actually had been 2 books about this. One that was written in 1955 by a TV journalist. It was more like a crime story, and I got access to that one. And then a little more comprehensive book that was written in 1972 by a Florida journalist, a crime writer, and a magazine publisher by the name of Hamilton Darby Perry. That book was published in 72, and I got a hold of that book, and he had actually interviewed Lonergan after Lonergan got out of prison, and he did it in Toronto. But there was a falling out between the 2 of them, and the book was written in a way that led me to believe there's much more to the story. I mean, he's got lots of good stuff in it, but I started digging more, and I realized that now I might be able to get access to the district attorney's files. So I had never looked into something like this before, but I discovered that New York has a really good archives for their city compared to other cities in the United States and Canada. And I contacted someone at the New York Records Office that led me to this fantastic woman in New York who helped me. And lo and behold, I was told one day they discovered all the files from 1943 and 1944. And so we got them digitized. And one day I got this huge dump of files. They essentially took about 1,650 pictures of files for me. And my daughter Mia, who thank God was there to help me organize this and put them in some readable. Then I got them all printed out. And when I started reading, I realized I hit the jackpot, because it's police correspondence, witness statements, witness biographies of people that are very hard to find, every single person connected with the case, the kind of thinking that went into it, the ultimate interrogation of Lonergan, and then subsequent trial documents, and the medical examiner's report, which became an issue at the trial, which was fascinating as well. It just literally every single piece of information one would need to recreate a story like this. And so I realized I had a really good book in my view, and it was great doing the whole thing. And after having spent a couple years doing these massive books, like on Toronto and the Jewish community, which is just massive amounts of research, this was a concentrated story with apart from I had newspapers, and I went to New York, and I tracked down some people that were connected to the case in Toronto, and people that knew Wayne Lonergan, and I visited all the spots. I mean, that's one good thing about doing something about Manhattan. The buildings are still there. I mean, the house at 313 East 51st Street near 3rd Avenue is still there, and there's a doctor who lives in this beautiful townhouse, and I did actually contact her, but I don't think she knew that there had been a murder in the place in 1943, and she wasn't really keen on letting me look around her place. So, I mean, I guess the building looks the same on the outside. I sort of stood outside there for one day, just looking around, but I didn't really have the courage to go knock on the door. But it was interesting to see. And then there were other places in the story that I also visited. So that brought it to life for me. And so the research was fantastic. And when you could still travel, I was we went to New York, and I visited all these spots. So that was good also.
So how did Lonergan, who came from like kind of a Irish background in Toronto the good, back in the old days when it was a really straight-laced kind of a city, how does he meet this wealthy young woman who's the scion of a wealthy Jewish brewing family.
Right.
And
Yes.
how do they meet?
It's peculiar for sure. I mean, he had a rough life. His mother was bipolar, I guess we would call it today, and so he grew up in his father died when he was relatively young, I think still in high school, and the mom was not well a lot of his life, and she ended up going into psychiatric institutions on several occasions, and he ran into trouble with juvenile delinquency. And also, there were other issues that dealt with his sexuality. I mean, his homosexuality or his bisexuality is central to the story. Something that people didn't talk about back then and tried to hide. And he had clearly an issue that was complicated with him, like it was for many men and women during this era. So he was always looking for something. He dropped out of school, when he was 16. He had a bunch of jobs that weren't really going anywhere. He was a lifeguard, and he worked as a photographer's assistant, which he later did also, and he was a private cop for the government. And eventually, in 1939, when he was like about 23-ish, he got a job with Greyhound, who was running a bus dispatching service at the New York World's Fair, which was the biggest event in the world at the time. And so he was going to move to New York and find his fortune. At that World's Fair, I mean, he meets eventually Patricia's father, a man named William Burton. It's actually Bernheimer, but he changed his name. A lot of German Jews who were very wealthy during World War I decided, well, for two reasons. One, they thought that there was anti-German sentiment, which there was, but it was mostly because of anti-Semitism, and these people wanted to disassociate themselves from all the Eastern European Jews that were then inhabiting the Lower East Side. So these people were, very cultivated, and William was a painter, and he traveled to France, and he was very wealthy because his father, who had built up the brewing business that his father had started, had died and left a lot of money. So William and his brother George had lots of money, and William was probably also bisexual or just gay, and he had married his mother. He had married Patricia's mother, Lucille, out of some sort of pressure that was put on him in the family. She had come from a southern, from the southern United States, although her family had lost a bit of their money after the Civil War. But at some point, William encounters Wayne, probably at the World's Fair. In one of Wayne's kind of jobs, they had these chairs, I guess. They were like people were pushed around the fair, and young, strong men pulled them around, and sort of like a rickshaw, but not quite that, I think. It was a chair on wheels. And the story is that's one version. The other version is they met at a bar. But, and I get this early in the book, I would say 99% sure that William and Wayne had some sort of relationship for a little while. And William introduces Wayne to his daughter Patricia, who is a couple years younger than him, and that's how it sort of starts. And then William dies from a heart attack, which also a lot of people there in their family died young. I mean, he was only 45, and he died in 1940, just a couple years before this was going on. And he left a lot of money, and so Patricia was fairly wealthy at the age of 20, 21, and she starts dating Wayne, which is kind of strange. There's a great, I don't know if it's true or not. There's a lot of writing about this case in the tabloid newspapers at the time, and in a world without Twitter and social media and Instagram, the tabloids were it. I mean, they were the New York Daily News and New York Daily Mirror, and all these papers were Journal American. There was another one. I mean, they were relentless and they wrote about everything. So there was a line that was Patricia is supposed to have said about Wayne, that if he's good enough for my father, he's good enough for me. I don't know if that's true or not, and it's kind of strange, but it was quoted many times in many articles. It was even actually, someone wrote a half-baked novel about the case in the 1960s, and they even got that line in there too. So they started dating, and ultimately, against Lucille, the mother of Lucille's judgment, and who didn't like Wayne, and may have probably known her. Her marriage with William was rocky, and they had got divorced and then remarried too when Patricia was a very young girl. I mean, these people spent half the year in France. They had a villa in the south of France near Caen, and then traveled back to New York, and then they split up, and after fights, and Lucille and William rather, and then so Patricia was really raised by nannies, and she was spoiled. But not, during when World War I started, World War II, started, she did do some nursing care and volunteer work, so she wasn't without that kind of responsibility. Wayne, on the other hand, did nothing other than play bridge. But he
played bridge at one point with Somerset
Mom. Yes, they had bridge games, but he got caught cheating. I mean, he had been Wayne was introduced into this world that he must have been astounded by. Here's a guy coming from a middle-class home in Toronto. I stood outside the apartment on Park Avenue near about 50th Street, where him and Patricia lived for a while. They ran away to Las Vegas and eloped. That is what happened. But I stood outside this thing, and I'm just thinking to myself, here's Wayne Lonergan coming from a house in Toronto, although today that house in Toronto is probably worth $1 million, but not in 1943. He must have thought he hit the jackpot in every sense of the word. But their marriage was extremely bad from the start. I mean, for a variety of reasons. Probably one, because of his sexuality, two, because he had no money of his own, and she was essentially supporting him, which in the 1940s was regarded as not, really good thing to do, and it was frowned upon by people and written about in the newspapers. But Wayne more or less didn't care, although it probably frustrated him, and he liked, good things. I've seen.
And they were both very smitten by this.
Yes.
What you say in the title, Café Society. What's that?
Okay, well, the Café Society, which again, I have to be honest, I didn't know a lot about. In the 1930s and 40s, there was this nightclub culture in New York. The Stork Club is the most famous, and maybe people have heard about El Morocco Club and the 21 Club, which is the only one of them that's still standing. They have these jockeys, these kind of politically incorrect jockeys in front, little models that you can see still today. And I actually did visit and talk to the people that work there, because the place is more or less the way it was in the 1940s. The Stork Club is now just a burger joint, and the people in there had no idea. But these places were fancy clubs. The rich and famous of New York, Broadway, Hollywood actors visiting New York. They would go out, drink very expensive champagne, eat fantastically expensive food, dance to live music. And there's a whole culture, and journalists would take pictures, and they would be in society pages, Walter Winchell, Ed Sullivan, Dorothy Kilgallen. They all wrote these gossip columns like every day about who's visiting the club, and to get your picture taken by a guy named Jerome Zerbe, who was one of the first, I suppose, paparazzi, but in a nice way. He was a sort of a dignified paparazzi. It was a really big deal. And so there was, they analyzed it, wrote about it. It's just, it's from our point of view, the whole thing would seem pretty pretentious, but it still, I guess, goes on to a certain extent. And because it was in New York, there's sort of a myth built up around it, and they gave it this name, Café Society. There later actually was an actual nightclub called Café Society, and it was the first integrated club in the city, but that wasn't really part of the Café Society scene. So and Patricia and Wayne were part of that. They wanted to be. They were sort of on the outskirts of it initially, or wannabes. I call them. Walter Winchell coined the phrase "celebutantes." Yeah, decades before Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian. And then that's what Patricia was. She was like a celebutante. She was famous for being famous, and she wanted to be mentioned. That's what I say in the beginning of the book. I mean, the tragedy of her life is that she was extremely famous, but she was no longer around to revel in this explosion of celebrity. And so they spent a lot of time doing this. She had enough money. Neither of them really had a full-time job. And then they had a child in 1942, the summer of 42. And their marriage started falling apart for money, for the reasons that I mentioned, money. And I think stories were getting out there that Lonergan was really only married to her for her money, and she didn't like that. And at one point there was a lot of fighting. He behaved kind of poor. He would take her to a club and then just disappear and leave her, and she'd have to find her own way home, that kind of stuff. And so there was anybody the police later interviewed about them, there was a lot of fighting, and the marriage was rocky. And and there's all these accusations about their sex life. So I don't know, I can't really 100% exactly what went on, but they lived in a nice place. She had a nanny, full-time nanny, and a maid looked after them. And so two things happened at that point. One, Wayne is actually because he was a Canadian, it didn't preclude him from being drafted into the U.S. Army. So this one day, about 1941, I guess after Pearl Harbor, he got an induction notice. And one of the ways people got out of this was to say that they were gay. The U.S. Army at the time was pathologically paranoid about admitting homosexuals into the army. And everybody knew this, and they tried to, uncover people who were fooling around. But I found all sorts of articles that people, if you read them, you would, the whole attitude about it, which I deal with in the book, is quite shocking. It was 75 years ago, but they could have been, 300 years ago in terms of their attitudes about it. And it was a crime, and something that was all linked to crime itself. That homosexuals committed crime, that there was perversion, and that they should be arrested. And it was something that was learned, and not necessarily you were born with. So people lost their jobs in Canada, the United States, and Britain, and right up into the 1950s and 60s. So Wayne was very, he was reticent about even talking about it, but yet, on this occasion, he did use it, and for reasons that in the report you'd have to see, they weren't sure whether he was actually telling the truth, but they decided that he wasn't worthy and he was a liar, and he probably had some, personality problems. So they gave him a 4F classification. Then by the time their marriage falls apart, by the summer of 1943. Patricia essentially kicks him out of the place. He mucks around a little. She's still giving him money though, and he's still living in New York. And then he decides at the end of August 1943 to enlist in the Royal Canadian Air Force and go back to Toronto. Though he has a child who's about 17 months old, and he thinks that maybe they'll reconcile for whatever reason. And so we come. He's allowed as a cadet. He signs up in Toronto, he's trained, and soon after his training, he's allowed to visit his family in New York, or his son. And on the weekend, he arrives late on October 22nd, 1943. In those days, it took about 3 hours to fly from Toronto to New York. And he stays at the house of a very wealthy friend, another guy named John Hargis, whose family was old banking money. And this is another guy that Wayne had been lucky enough to meet, and somehow they became friends. This Hargis also was recently divorced or separated from his wife. He's a very wealthy man, and he allows Wayne to stay at his place on 79th Street. And I visited his place too, or stood outside it and talked to the doorman there, and gave me the history of the building. So Saturday morning, October 23rd, is when sort of the action in the book starts, and by Sunday morning, October 24th, Patricia is dead. Although no, they don't find her body until later that day, much later, because they think she's not there initially. And eventually a friend comes over after the the nanny and the mother are very concerned that they hadn't found they hadn't seen her or heard from her. They break into the room and discover the body. That's how the book starts.
How did she die?
Well, according to the medical examiner's report, she was hit in the head with a onyx kind of glass thing that she had on her, two of them. They were two orbs that was sitting on her bed dresser. They were broken. And she was also strangled. And, to me, the murder was rage. The story, I mean, again, I'm always, as we talked about earlier, I don't know how much I want to tell. No one will have to read the book if I continue to give away the entire story here. But she had decided to write him out of her will. But I should add, Patricia's grandmother, her name was Stella, was a very wealthy woman because she inherited William Burton's father's money, and Patricia was the sole heir. And so when Stella died, Patricia would have inherited about $7 million, which at the time would have been, let's say, about $65 million. Stella didn't die till 1954, at which time if Patricia had lived, she would have got all that money. So it all actually went to the little boy, who is today a very wealthy man, but that's another story. So she wrote Wayne out of the will entirely, though he attempted various legal maneuverings to try to get it. He never could or did. So that was one issue. And then, according to Wayne, what Wayne later told the police, or in the DA in New York, she said in a moment of rage, I guess, or anger, that he couldn't see their kid anymore. Billy, his name was, William or Billy. And I guess he snapped, is really what happened. I don't believe it was premeditated from everything I understand about the case and read. But it's one of those moments, sort of reminds me of, the end of a TV show where somebody just loses it, and he just snapped and did it. But, proving that is really the story in the book, because it's much more.
But Allan, didn't he at one point admit to killing her?
Well, yeah, that's the other, right. I mean, there, two things happen. One, when he's first, I mean, I'm sort of skipping ahead, but eventually he's the person of interest in the case. He's already back in Toronto. The Toronto police are asked to find him, and by the New York police and legal authorities. So they take him, and he's not charged with any crime, strangely. He doesn't ask to speak to a lawyer, which is another issue. Some Canadian lawyers believe that his rights were trampled upon. I mean, they keep him locked up in a room for most of a day until the deputy ADA, a guy named John Lohr, comes from New York. I spoke to John Lohr's sons, one's a judge actually, told me about their father at the time was only 31 years old, and a young deputy. The guy in charge of the case in New York was a guy named Jacob Grumet. He was like the ADA, or assistant district attorney, in charge of the homicide division. That was another, by the way, I went to the courthouse where all these guys lived on the buildings, and you always see them at the end of Law and Order or any show. They're on the steps there in that big building. But that's it, and it's still there, and that's where the case unfolded. So that was fun. No one was shooting a movie or TV show when I was there, though. So Wayne did. He does give one story in Toronto, and he comes up with an alibi that is again based in a homosexual encounter, which then he said he met a soldier, and part of the story is Wayne's missing uniform, because it has blood on it from the murder. It disappears. So he initially says that this American soldier who he had an encounter with late at night on the Saturday night that he was there stole the uniform. Why an American soldier would want a uniform is another matter. He didn't. And then eventually the press get a hold of this, and it leads to lurid headlines about Wayne that upset him. The New York Daily News has a headline, "Twisted Sex," which if we have some time, I'll run through. I have a picture of it. And it taints everything. That when you and I were talking about the title of the book, the title of the book comes from that 2 days after that story was exposed, because the police were feeding journalists all the time. These guys had inside information. When that alibi was given, and it centered essentially around a homosexual encounter, Wayne was painted in the as immoral and a pervert. So if I could, the quote at the beginning, I'll just read it. It was printed in the New York Journal American, October 30th, 1943. The person who wrote this, throughout the pattern of the Lonergan murder are woven the purple threads of whispered vices whose details are unprintable and whose character in general is unknown to or misunderstood by the average normal person. I mean, and that's how Wayne was portrayed. And even after he recanted this, and he did in fact confess what you were alluding to, later he's brought to New York and he tells another story of what I had mentioned already, more or less, that they had this sort of bitter conflict, and in a rage he hit her and killed her. That image of him remains in the paper right to the end, and it taints the jury for sure. So that was the other interesting aspect of the story that I thought it had a social historical aspect and was rather unique. I mean, I'd never come across a murder story of that nature. This is more than a husband in a rage killing his wife. There's this whole other story and aspect to it that I thought was kind of interesting.
So he was sent to jail eventually.
Oh, he was. Yeah, he went through 2 trials which has their own. It's another which is detailed in the book as well, and he is. I have to say that it was all based on his confession. Had this happened today, the DNA, I'm sure, would have proven that he did it, in about 20 minutes. But they did find blood in the room, and they found a half fingerprint. But even the technology was so poor. First of all, there's no DNA, not till the 1990s. So that was out. I mean, they did identify blood in those days. They were called blood groupings, but it really didn't prove much because, so they found blood type O. That happened to be Wayne's. Well, 25%, 40% of the people on the planet have blood type O. So what is that? Or the kind of cigarette he smoked, couldn't prove anything. And the fingerprint was unusable. They didn't even use it in court. In fact, the medical examiner hardly testified. And they gave the defendant as little information as possible. Well, one of the other things about this case that I found, I really learned a lot about how New York law works, because each state is quite different, and the way they treat evidence and disclosure. And in fact, in New York, really until recently, that the district attorney is under no obligation to turn over evidence at all, anything. And it was only changed there was a series of changes over the years, but it took a long time. And in other states, it's much, like in California, they have rules that are a little stricter in terms of what the defendant has a right to see. But just Jacob Grumet did not give the defense attorney, who was a bombastic lawyer, really anything. And they only gave him a summary of the medical examiner's report. So the defense attorney and Lonergan always believed that there's something more. But I actually have both copies of the entire medical examiner's report and the summary. And really, he didn't leave out all that much. I compared them. There's maybe 5 pages missing, but they're of things that really didn't really change the thing that she was killed by something, by being hit in the head and being choked. But of course, the district attorney could have just given him everything, but chose not to, and because he didn't have to. And it's just this is the way they operated. And the other aspect was the way in which they treat confessions. In most nowadays, the judge has to decide whether a confession was coerced. Wayne's lawyer later said that he did confess, but they said that he was beaten and starved, and he wasn't. I can 100% or 99% for sure, based on what I've seen and read and every affidavit from every person who came into contact with. But in those days, New York juries were given by themselves the right to decide whether or not. They changed the law was changed, or was on a Supreme Court ruling in the 1960s, which in fact led to Wayne's new lawyers, the other one had died, trying to overturn the case, or at least get a hearing, but they turned him down, and that's just near the time that he was released. So yeah, he ended up spending 22 years in prison in Sing Sing and Dannemora. And he got out and came back to Toronto in December 1965. I got a great picture from the Globe and Mail of him arriving that day looking.
But didn't he, when he's coming back to Toronto, doesn't Scott Young, Neil
Yes.
Young's father,
Yes.
get involved in
Yes,
the story?
Scott Young was a columnist for the Globe and Mail, Neil Young's father, and he was fascinated by the case, and he had talked to Lonergan, and he met Lonergan. The authorities dropped him off in Quebec, and Scott Young and a photographer were there. Lonergan initially didn't want to talk to them, and eventually he gets a ride back and shares a steak dinner, and he gets a picture. And later, I was able to track down the audio recording of This Hour Has 7 Days, which was a famous Canadian television show, sort of like 60 Minutes, but much more brash. And the 2-hour audio interview between Scott Young and a journalist that worked at the CBC at the time, Ken Zafoli, and they both interviewed or took turns interviewing Lonergan, and then they edited it down. They didn't actually, I couldn't get access to the actual show, but the audio files, I could hear Lonergan talking, and two things that struck me. One, he had a very thick Bronx, New York accent, and in fact used the phrase "forget about it" several times. And in not once in 2 hours did he mention Patricia's name. When Zafoli asked him, "Did you kill your wife?" he said, "My position is no," which is a kind of strange, but he just referred to her as my wife, but never uttered her name once, which I thought was interesting. But he ended up finding a woman, an actress, Barbara Hamilton, who for whatever reason decided to look after him, and he sort of another woman would take care of him.
You mean Barbara Hamilton, who was considered to be Canada's funniest actress?
Yes.
Appeared in Anne of Green Gables
Right,
as
her, yes.
Marilla?
Yes, she passed away, but I did talk to Gordon Pinson and the actor, and Leah Pinson, his
Why did you
daughter,
talk to them?
Yeah, well, Gordon and Pinson lived next door they lived in the same apartment complex in Toronto. Gordon and his wife Charmaine or Charm, and lived next door to Barbara and Wayne, and they had coffee together. So it took me a little while, but I got Gordon Pinson on the phone, and he told me about Wayne and what he was like. Very quiet, he said. Leah Pinson, who was 12, thought that Wayne was kind of creepy, but didn't say much. And Barbara never talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, she never would. If she ever was interviewed, they weren't allowed to ask her about Wayne, and he ended up dying of cancer in 1986 in Toronto.
So looking back over the broad sweep of this story and what you learned along the way, what's it mean? What's the appeal of this story?
I think it's from a true crime point of view. I mean, it's just an interesting saga, but it also is about the way in which police interacted with, and dealt with homosexuality at the time, the way in which the rich lived and how they operated, and the way in which a story can be built up in the press to the point where it's almost they lose control over it. And this happens to this day, so it's just another example. I mean, eventually it does fade away, but it certainly, as I say, pushed the Second World War off the front pages. Some journalists commented about this. There's all this fighting going on in Europe, and the front page of the New York Times is Wayne Lonergan and people dying and trying to get into the courtroom, which had limited seating. I mean, it basically captured the attention of the entire city for about 6 weeks.
Now, I'm going to ask you, but I don't want you to tell me. Do you think he killed her?
Well, I suppose I shouldn't answer that, but
No, you shouldn't.
Okay.
No, because it's like it is at the core of the story. He at one point confesses, and then he changes his mind.
I guess you'll have to read. Yeah, you'll have to read.
Yeah.
I end the book by standing outside. I sort of describe standing outside and describe what happens, what I think happened.
And where does this book fit in the context of your 15 other books? I mean, it was your capacity to understand the depth and breadth of Canadian history and Jewish history and so many other histories. I mean, I can hardly wait till your next book. But you are an extremely productive writer.
I am, yes, but I have to say, it gets harder each time. My family inspires me. I'm always looking for a good story. That's really, I like telling good stories and something that people want to look at. And as I said, I've written a lot of sweeping books, big, huge sagas, and those are really hard books in some ways. This was, in a sense, more enjoyable and I would say easier to write, and plus plus a good excuse to travel to New York. But it appealed more to my interest in these kinds of stories that I've spent Angie and I've spent the COVID era watching all these British mysteries on television. Of like 6 episodes are really good, and I always those stories always, Murder in Small Town or something, and that always appeals to me, and I think that's really what this is about.
I think I first discovered your writing in the Sam Klein mysteries.
Yeah, right. Well, that was another. Right.
I was absolutely smitten by them. The blood libel starting out the whole. I mean, it was so rich and complex and so full of revelations about early Canadian life and Jewish life and discrimination and the nature of the title of the book, the alleged blood libel. Your work is fascinating, and you were a big seller in Germany, right? Those Sam Klein mysteries.
Yes, they thought that Winnipeg's North End was extremely exotic, and were fascinated by the stories. That is true. In 2004, I went to Germany, and the publisher there who bought the book had German actors acting out scenes in German. And my book is pretty fascinating in these smoke-filled bookstores that you could do in Germany at the time, and it was great. They were very keen on the whole thing. So that was a lot of fun. Yeah, no, those were tough though. Writing fiction is another whole thing, and it is definitely challenging.
But I had dreamed at one point to walk through the North End of Winnipeg with you, with a microphone, to talk about the settings, the location, the characters, and then go out to where the Bronfmans were from,
right?
And for the latter book in that trilogy, right?
Right.
Yeah. You're a pretty fantastic writer, and I have to say, as a reader, you've really enriched my life in many different ways.
Thanks, Terry.
So, what are you working on now?
That is a good question, given my agent's listening. I'm plugging away here. The COVID has made my life a little more difficult because some of the places that I like to speak to or talk to, and it's very hard to get answers and stuff. So I am let's say I'm investigating certain stories as well. But I am writing, actually, I just finished a book for the radiology department. I've written 2 books about Manitoba medicine that I've been commissioned to write. One was about anesthesiology, which is, as Angie says, a book that'll put you to sleep. And she calls this book my first X-rated book on radiology. But that's going to come out in the next several months or next year. But I was working with different people on it, Ted Lyons, and so that's also occupied my time right now.
Now we have some questions coming in for you, and this one says, to what extent was Wayne's purported sexual tendencies a factor in the law enforcement and court decisions, including the court of public opinion?
Well, certainly in the court of public opinion, people convicted him and believed he was guilty because of that, I would say. The police, he accused the police of saying nasty things to him and treating him differently and saying derogatory remarks. They denied doing that. So, but clearly there was a bias against him, and I did read about snide remarks that were made, and people admitted that they had said them. But he was not tortured or hurt physically in any way, in my view.
Now, Morley Walker also sent us a question. Morley, of course, former books columnist for the Free Press and a very gifted writer himself. He asks, do we get a free piece of cake delivered to our house if we buy the book?
Sure, anytime. Yeah, we've got Jeannie's cake standing by here. You buy the book, you get a piece of Jeannie's cake.
And we have another comment from Hillary McMahon.
Yeah, that's my
I think
agent.
Your agent. And it's up to you whether you wish to mention that bit of rapport, good sir, she says. And there's one other question that I wanted to make sure I got in. Did you find writing this book in terms of your process similar or different from your writing of novels? Was true crime more challenging because there's an element of nonfiction to it?
I would say it was, yeah, no, it was, again, having completed this massive book on Jews in Canada that I had to research so much for. This was much, much easier in terms of, I wrote it as a nonfiction book. I mean, it's got end notes and everything is sourced. So I wrote it as a, very creative kind of nonfiction book. It's more or less the way I always approach nonfiction. But as I said, it was just less all-consuming because it's just more it was just more manageable and in terms of the time period. And I did spend a lot of time on the phone tracking. I talked to a lot of law professors in New York, lawyers, all sorts of fascinating people. As I said, one of the things now, from an historian's point of view, years ago, I would have had to spend hours and hours going into the university libraries, tracking down journal articles. But now I can get access to almost anything ever written, honestly, from 40, 50 years ago, and have it on my computer in 2 minutes. I can't even tell you, and having access to newspapers. My publisher also gave me access to newspapers.com, which has some newspapers that, let's say, the U of M that I can get some papers from don't have. And that also is just, years ago, you'd have to sit there with microfilm with the New York Times and try to find the right day and then use this contraption to make a copy. I mean, that kind of stuff can occupy months of your time. So it's just so much easier and faster nowadays. I mean, it's when I wrote the Mackenzie King biography, his whole diary is digitized, 30,000 pages. I mean, it's all there. You can add and search it as well. You just can't. I can't tell you how much faster and easier it is to work that way.
I do want to mention, though, that you got some very fine compliments from Daniel Richmond, a former federal prosecutor in the now famous Southern District of New York, which is so much in the news.
I will add one thing about Daniel. He also now teaches at law at Columbia, but he was one of the people I reached out to, and he ended up helping me a lot. But he is also friends with James Comey, which I thought was really interesting. and he advised Comey on several things. So I was hoping that he would be in that movie, but he never made it into it.
Now, the last time I interviewed Ian Rankin, the great Scottish crime novelist, when he was in town, I asked him, and I want to ask you the same question as we wrap up here. What is it about murder mysteries, especially in a world so full of other kinds of chaos? Why do we care so much, or why are we so interested in murder mysteries?
I think it's pure human drama and suspense at it. I think at its finest, and for whatever reason, people are drawn to stories like that. It satisfies a particular, interest in us, and it's personal, and especially when it involves this kind of, money, sex, broken marriage, and all sorts of other social issues. I mean, I've written a lot about social and moral issues through the 20th century, and I've been, I wrote an earlier book called Devil in Babylon on the period from 1880 to 1930 that looked at a lot of this stuff. So in some ways, this book is a continuation of that book.
Oh, Allan, the questions are still coming in. Pamela Manook writes, sounds like a Patricia Highsmith novel. In fact, just wondering if it inspired any fictionalized version of the Wayne Lonergan
Well,
story.
yeah, there was a movie. What happened is when they first started making movies, they removed any reference to homosexuality that was taken out, so you couldn't, there in the back at the end of the book, I look at that aspect to it, so you can read about that. There's really one book written about it, a novel by I think he was a musical conductor of some sort. It was the only book he ever wrote. He was in his 60s and he died. It's pretty bad, but he doesn't really hide this. He takes the story literally and has some of the same lines from the tabloids, but it wasn't very good, to be honest. But I found it interesting to read.
Another question from Mel Kleiman, who asks,
he's my uncle.
well, but he wants to know if you contacted Lonergan's son, Billy.
Yes, a good question, Mel. Thank you. I didn't. I decided first of all, he disappears from the public record by about 1960 something. What happened was the grandmother, Lucille, raised him, and they changed his name. He took the last name Burton, the same as her, and he got rid of Lonergan, and he never apparently saw Lonergan again. At least that's what I can determine. I believe I tracked him down. I was going to contact him or try, but then I decided, what is it going to, he doesn't remember his mother, and his father was accused of killing her. So I was thinking to myself, the only thing he could really have told me was something about the grandmother, which I think would have been interesting. I was just hesitant. Dominic Dunn did actually write about this case. He used to write for Vanity Fair before he passed away. In 2000, he wrote a bit about the story. And he later put the story in a book about all the crimes that he had written about. And this was one of them. That was another essay that was interesting. But he had a lot of the facts wrong because he just based it on that other previous book that was written in the 70s. But he also decided not to look for the kid because he said the kid's life was obviously tragic in some way. And so when I read that, I decided maybe he had a point. And I just, it would have been kind of strange, to be honest. I sometimes regret not talking to him, but I think it was the right decision.
He's still living though, right?
I believe so. He would be about 78, 79 now, yeah.
And a very wealthy.
Probably in New York, very wealthy. I think he lived in Florida for a while, is what I've been told. I did track down one relative, a distant relative of the grandmother, Lucille, Patricia's mother. And that's what she told me, but she didn't know where he was. And I may not have been able to find him. I mean, it's not like I was going to go knock on his door in New York, and it may have been, somebody else, but no one I knew where he was or anything. But well, listen, I'm not sure what you think of the book, to be honest.
Yeah. Can you and I make a date to have a conversation in person about your next book, seeing as how you are such a productive writer?
I'll let you know as soon as I figure that out.
All right. Well, Allan, it's been a pleasure. And the book is so granular in its detail that it really takes you to every place that you write about in incredible description. It's wonderful for that.
Thank you. Well, that's because I think that's really because I had the resources to do that. That's why I think the book works so well, because I had the material, and that's why I think it works well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, pleasure, and well done, and congratulations. And John Taves,
thanks everybody for listening to this. You can go back to now watching the vice presidential debate.
Right, which starts in 5 minutes time. So okay. John Taves, back to you.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you, Allan. So yes, the book, Details Are Unprintable. We have signed copies that Allan has very kindly signed that are available at McNally Robinson Booksellers. You can order those online. You can visit us in store. You can give us a call. We even deliver both across Canada and within the city if you don't even want to leave the comfort of your home. So feel free to get in touch if you'd like a copy of this book. I'd like to thank our inimitable host, Mr. Terry MacLeod, Allan Levine, for not only his extensive knowledge of the period, but also for putting it together in this book. And thanks to Lyons Press for publishing it in the first place. And also thanks to all of you for joining us here this evening and sharing your time and your questions with us. It's been a real pleasure. Have a very good night, everyone.
Thanks.